The autumn air in Wilmington, 1978, smelled of damp North Carolina pine and the metallic tang of old locker room benches. On the white-painted plywood bulletin board at Laney High School, a single sheet of paper held the weight of a death sentence. A 15-year-old boy, his ears too large for his head and his limbs still gangly and unrefined, let his finger trace the list of names. He ran it down to the bottom edge once, then twice, searching for the letters that spelled Jordan. They weren't there. In the cold, bureaucratic logic of high school sports, Michael Jordan was a surplus, a scrap to be discarded. If you had asked the coaches then, they would have pointed to his lack of height, his unpolished jump shot, or the simple fact that a 5'10" sophomore didn't belong in the kingdom of varsity giants. He was relegated to the junior varsity squad, the scrap heap for the mediocre and the overlooked. The boy didn't scream. He didn't plead. He walked home, pushed past his brothers, and locked the door to his bedroom. For hours, the only sound was a muffled, rhythmic sob against a pillow, the sound of a private world collapsing. But when the 5:00 a.m. mist still clung to the asphalt, the following morning, the rhythmic thud of a basketball began to echo against the silence. It was the first note in a symphony of obsessive revenge. We are used to worshiping the Air Jordan of the Chicago Bulls, the deified icon floating toward a rim in a cathedral of flashbulbs. We forget the shivering boy in the dark who decided that sleep was an indulgence he could no longer afford. He began a 6:0 a.m. ritual that wasn't about basketball. It was about the systematic eradication of his own vulnerability. What if he had made the team that day? Would the world have ever seen the Black Cat, the predator who treated every opponent like a personal insult? Beneath the glint of 6 championship rings, how many layers of blackened, scarred tissue from that original rejection remain? Why, at the absolute zenith of his power, would he walk away to play minor league baseball in the dirt of Alabama? Was it a tribute to a murdered father, a retreat from a gambling scandal, or a desperate attempt to find the boy who once cried in a locked room? The boy who began shooting in the dark that morning had already killed the Michael Jordan we thought we knew. He was building a god out of spite. Wilmington, North Carolina, in the 1970s, was a place where the humidity clung to the skin like a wet wool blanket, and the dirt in the backyards was packed hard as concrete. By Bert, in the backyards was packed hard as concrete. By the rhythmic violence of brothers at play. In the Jordan household, the hierarchy was not dictated by age, but by the calloused hands of James Jordan. James was a man of the earth and the machine, a general electric mechanic who viewed the world through the lens of tangible utility. He valued the quiet, methodical grease of a car engine over the flighty, ethereal bounce of a ball. He looked at his eldest son, Larry, and saw a reflection of himself, sturdy, mechanically inclined, a boy who understood how to fix what was broken. He looked at Michael and saw a talkative dreamer who didn't want to get his hands dirty. The backyard was the forge. Under the flickering porch light, Michael and Larry engaged in a savage, wordless dialogue of elbows and sweat. Larry was stronger, more explosive, and possessed the verticality Michael had not yet found. Time and again, Michael would be sent sprawling into the Carolina dust, his lungs burning and his pride hemorrhaging. From the edge of the yard, James Jordan would watch, leaning against a pickup truck with a cigarette dangling from his lip. He didn't offer encouragement. He didn't offer a hand up. His silence was a cold, architectural assessment that Michael simply wasn't built for the grit of the real world. That gaze, a mix of indifference and disappointment, became the singular, driving ghost of Michael's life. This was not a warm, coming-of-age story. It was a desperate heist for a father's respect. Michael began to equate winning with existence itself. If he could not be the son who fixed the engine, he would be the son who conquered the world, forcing his father to finally look at him without squinting in disapproval. The rejection from the Laney High varsity team in 1978 was merely the public manifestation of a private, domestic ache. When he retreated to his room to cry, he wasn't mourning a jersey. He was mourning the possibility that his father was right, that he was, in the end, ordinary. The transformation that followed was almost biological in its intensity. He began to treat every waking second as a tactical strike against his own limitation. He would hang from the doorframe of his bedroom for hours, convinced that the sheer force of his will could stretch his bones and pull him toward the height he lacked. It was a pathetic, beautiful sight. A boy trying to out-negotiate genetics. This period birthed a mutation in his psyche. He developed a prey drive that transcended sport. He began to observe his teammates and opponents not as peers, but as variables to be solved, and then eliminated. Laney coach Laney Smith recognized the feral light in the boy's eyes and chose to feed the fire with gasoline. He offered no praise, only a brutal, indifferent discipline. He buried Michael in the most grueling defensive drills, forcing him to find his worth in the unglamorous mud of the game. Michael leaned into the suffering. He began to view the basketball court as the only place where he could exert absolute authority, a sanctuary where he could finally escape the shadow of his brother and the cold appraisal of his father. He wasn't playing for the love of the game. He was playing to settle a debt with the man leaning against the truck. By the time he finally made the varsity squad, he had already discarded the soft parts of his soul. He had become a weapon forged in the furnace of not being enough, and he was ready to point that weapon at anyone who dared to stand in his way. In the autumn of 1981, Chapel Hill was a sanctuary of Carolina blue, a place where basketball was treated not as a spectacle, but as a secular religion. When Michael Jordan arrived, he found himself standing before the high priest of the game, Dean Smith. Smith was a man of frighteningly precise order, a coach who believed that no individual, regardless of their vertical leap or the speed of their first step, was larger than the four corners of fence. To Michael, a boy who had survived the backyard by sheer, unbridled aggression, this was a spiritual straitjacket. Smith demanded that Michael bury his wings beneath a layer of tactical discipline, transforming him from a freelance predator into a cog in a high-functioning machine. It was a calculated ego death, a necessary pruning of the wild vines to ensure the strength of the trunk. The freshman year was a quiet war of attrition. Michael sat in the shadows of upperclassmen like James Worthy and Sam Perkins, absorbing the cold, geometric reality of Smith's philosophy. He was forbidden from showboating, from the acrobatic improvisations that had made him a local myth in Wilmington. He became a student of the unseen game, the spacing of a defensive rotation, the subtle leverage of a screen, the timing of a backdoor cut. But beneath the polished veneer of the UNC system, the fire he had stoked in the dark at 6:00 a.m. was turning into a pressurized furnace. He was waiting for the moment when the machine would fail, and only the ghost in the machine could save it. That moment arrived on March 29, 1982, at the Louisiana Superdome. The NCAA championship game was a clash of civilizations. North Carolina's refined discipline against the shot-blocking terror of Patrick Ewing and Georgetown. With 32 seconds left on the clock, the Tar Heels trailed by a single point. The air in the cavernous dome felt thick, heavy with the collective anxiety of millions. In the timeout huddle, Dean Smith looked past his veterans and locked eyes with the freshmen. It was a silent passing of the torch, a recognition that when the world is burning, you give the ball to the one who doesn't fear the heat. Michael stood on the left wing, the hardwood feeling like an extension of his own nervous system. When the ball swung toward him, The crowd's roar flattened into a singular buzzing hum. There was no hesitation, no memory of the freshman label. He rose into the air with a mechanical, haunting calmness, his eyes level with the rim he had visualized in his dreams during those lonely Wilmington nights. The release was a whisper of fingertips. As the ball arched through the vacuum of the arena and tore through the nylon, a new reality was forged. That shot killed Mike and birthed Michael. He had tasted the ultimate narcotic, the power to rewrite a narrative in the final heartbeat of a crisis. He had proven that he could operate within the system until the system could no longer contain the magnitude of the moment. As he jogged back down the court with a thin, predatory smile, the boy who had been cut from varsity was gone. He had found his throne. But the victory brought a dangerous realization that the high of the win was temporary, and the hunger it created was bottomless. He had ascended to the top of the college world, only to realize that the mountain he truly wanted to climb had no peak. He was no longer just a player. He was a shark that had tasted blood in the water, and the vast, dark ocean of the NBA was calling his name. Chicago, in 1984, was a city of ghosts and rusted steel, a metropolis where the professional basketball team, the Bulls, was a decaying footnote in the city's sporting ledger. When Michael Jordan stepped into that locker room, he didn't find a brotherhood. He found a graveyard of ambition. The air was thick with the scent of cheap cigars, stale sweat, and the faint chemical bitterness of the cocaine culture that gripped the NBA's underbelly in the mid-'80s. His teammates were men who had traded their hunger for a paycheck and a party. Jordan, with the ascetic discipline of a monk and the cold eyes of a hired assassin, refused the offerings of the night. He locked himself in the gym, treating the ball like a rosary and the hardwood like a confessional. He was a Puritan in a den of thieves, realizing early on that to pull this franchise out of the mud, he would first have to walk through it alone. The initiation into the professional ranks wasn't a matter of skill. It was a matter of survival against the sheer, grinding apathy of a losing culture. Jordan began to harvest points with a frequency that bordered on the sadistic. His daps, his hang time, his ability to stall in mid-air as if gravity were merely a suggestion. It all felt like a new language being spoken in a room full of mute. But the reality of the league was a blunt instrument. A savior could score 40 a night, and the scoreboard would still reflect a loss. He was a Ferrari engine bolted to a rusted tractor frame. The frustration began to crystallize into a private, jagged isolation. He was learning that in the NBA, excellence was a lonely country, and the border was guarded by men who resented his light. In the second season, the machinery broke. Against the Golden State Warriors, a sickening pop echoed through the arena, a fracture of the navicular bone in his left foot. It was a death rattle for his momentum. The doctors spoke in the detached, sterilized tones of actuarial science. A 20% chance he would never walk without a limp, a career potentially aborted before it had truly begun. Management, eyeing the high draft picks that come with a losing season, ordered their golden goose to stay in the coop. To the front office, he was a long-term asset. To Michael, he was a caged predator being told his claws were a liability. The forced stillness was a psychic torture. He could endure pain, but he could not endure being irrelevant. In a move of suicidal defiance, he bypassed the healers and returned to the court ahead of schedule. He bullied the management into giving him minutes, however restricted, as if he were haggling for his soul. This desperate return culminated in the spring of 1986, in the hallowed, hostile cathedral of the Boston Garden. Facing the Celtics, the gold standard of basketball intelligence and white-collar grit, Jordan unleashed a performance that felt less like a game and more like a celestial event. He carved through the legendary defense of Bird, McHale, and Parrish with a predatory grace, his tongue out, his body a blur of red and white against the green and white parquet. He hung 63 points on the scoreboard that night, a playoff record that remains a jagged peak in the history of the sport. He was hitting fadeaways over double teams and finishing at the rim through the kind of physical contact that would have unraveled a lesser man. After the final buzzer, Larry Bird, the reigning king of the era, stood in the locker room with a look of stunned, almost religious conviction. He told the press, "I think it's just God disguised as Michael Jordan." It was the ultimate benediction, a recognition from the mountaintop that a new deity had arrived. Yet, beneath the divine praise lay a bitter, grounding truth. Despite the 63 points, despite the transcendence, the Bulls lost the game and were swept from the playoffs. As Jordan sat in the visiting locker room, his foot submerged in a bucket of ice that hissed as it met his overheated skin, he stared at the floor. Bird's compliment was a gilded cage. He had touched the sun and come back to earth with nothing but a box score and a loss. The realization was a cold, sharp blade to the gut. Being a god was not enough if you were a god of nothing. He didn't just need to be better than the men across from him. He needed to be so powerful that he could dictate the very heartbeat of the men beside him. The era of the flying savior was over. The era of the tyrant of Chicago was beginning to take shape in the shadows of that Boston defeat. Detroit in the late 1980s was a city of rust, gasoline, and a blue-collar fury that found its spiritual home in the Silverdome. The Pistons, led by the diminutive, smiling, and lethal Isaiah Thomas, had built a fortress out of spite. They were the bad boys, a collection of basketball outlaws who viewed the league's marketing of Michael Jordan as a personal affront to their grit. To them, Jordan was a pretty boy from North Carolina who belonged in a highlight reel, not in the trenches of a championship run. They didn't just want to beat him. They wanted to deconstruct him, piece by bloody piece. This was the birth of the Jordan Rules, a tactical manifesto that essentially legalized assault as long as it happened within the four corners of a hardwood floor. The rules were simple. If Michael Jordan leaves his feet, he must land on his back. Every time he drove into the paint, he wasn't met by a defender. He was met by a riot. Rick Mahorn's forearms, Bill Laimbeer's elbows, and Dennis Rodman's frantic, claustrophobic pestering became the physical limits of Jordan's world. He was hammered in midair, his ribs taking the brunt of industrial-grade screens, his jerseys frequently torn as he was dragged to the floor. For 3 years, from 1988 to 1990, the Pistons functioned as a meat grinder, and Jordan was the prime cut. Each spring, the Bulls would ascend to the Eastern Conference Finals only to be methodically, violently dismantled. The humiliation of 1990 was the breaking point. After a crushing Game 7 loss in Detroit, Jordan sat on the team bus, a wet towel draped over his head to hide the tears of a man who had given everything and found it insufficient. He realized that his God-given grace was a liability in a world ruled by the bad boys. The aerial poetry that had defined his early career was being edited out by the blunt prose of a Pistons forearm. He looked at his own reflection, lean, elegant, and ultimately breakable. He realized that to kill a monster, he would have to build a bigger one inside himself. He didn't need more talent. He needed more armor. That summer, the Breakfast Club was born. Jordan recruited a young trainer named Tim Grover with a singular grim directive. Make me strong enough to break them. While the rest of the league was on vacation, Jordan was in his private gym at 6:00 a.m., lifting weights until his muscles screamed for oxygen. This wasn't about aesthetics. It was about ballistic survival. He consumed massive amounts of protein and pushed his body through a specialized regimen of functional mass training. He added 20 pounds of slab-like muscle to his frame, turning his shoulders into battering rams and his chest into a shield. He was systematically murdering the Air Jordan of the mid-'80s to make room for a heavier, more terrestrial, and far more dangerous predator. The transformation was as much psychological as it was physical. The gym became a site of ritualized hatred. Every rep was a mental strike against Isaiah Thomas. Every set was a response to a Lambeer elbow. Jordan's personality, already prone to an obsessive competitiveness, began to harden into a terrifying singular focus. He began to treat his own teammates with a mirrored version of the Pistons' cruelty, berating them in practice, demanding they match his threshold for pain. He understood that to survive the Detroit gang, the Chicago Bulls could no longer be a basketball team. They had to be a paramilitary unit. He was willing to be hated by his peers if it meant being feared by his enemies. When the 1991 playoffs arrived, the Pistons found a different man waiting for them. The finesse was still there, but it was now backed by a core of cold, unyielding iron. When Lambeer tried to shove him in the post, Jordan didn't budge. When the Jordan rules were applied, he simply powered through the contact, finishing at the rim with a newfound, heavy-handed authority. The Bulls swept the Pistons in 4 games of clinical, vengeful brilliance. As the bad boys famously walked off the court before the final buzzer, refusing to shake hands, Jordan stood at mid-court with a look of icy, detached satisfaction. He had outsuffered the sufferers. He had learned that the path to the throne wasn't through the clouds, but through the mud, over the broken bodies of those who thought they could break him. He wasn't just a player anymore. He was a sovereign who had finally secured his borders with blood and iron. Gah! As the final buzzer echoed through the forum, Michael Jordan didn't sprint toward the rafters. He retreated to the locker room and collapsed. He clutched the Larry O'Brien trophy with a grip that turned his knuckles white, burying his face in his trembling hands and heaving with a sob that sounded like a dam finally bursting. It wasn't a cry of joy. It was the sound of 7 years of accumulated scar tissue finally tearing open. Beside him, James Jordan placed a calloused hand on his son's shoulder, a mechanic's hand steadying a high-performance engine that had finally reached its limit. This was the birth of the first dynasty, the moment Phil Jackson's triangle offense had successfully harnessed Michael's feral energy into a collective, unstoppable weapon. But at the summit of the mountain, the oxygen was thin, and the wind was cold. By the time the second and third rings arrived in 1992 and 1993, Michael Jordan was no longer a man. He was a global commodity, a secular deity polished to a high sheen by Nike and Coca-Cola. The world demanded he be a flawless avatar of the American dream, but beneath the $5,000 suits and the expensive cigars, a darker, more jagged version of the man was suffocating. The Be Like Mike campaign had created a cage of impossible expectations. In the shadows of the arena, the gambling debts began to surface. The late nights in Atlantic City, the high-stakes golf matches, the $57,000 checks to money launderers. The media, once his greatest hagiographers, became a pack of wolves sensing blood in the water. They didn't want the hero anymore. They wanted to see the god bleed. Every flashbulb was a silent interrogation. How can you be perfect when you are so deeply flawed? Jordan met the scrutiny with a hardening of the heart. His play on the court remained a masterclass in psychological warfare, but the light in his eyes was being replaced by a dull, predatory fatigue. He told his father that the game had stopped giving him the shiver. He was winning by rote, a shark circling a tank that had grown too small for his ambition. He was tired of being the icon, tired of being the product, and tired of the relentless, moralizing gaze of a public that didn't understand the cost of his obsession. Then, in the summer of 1993, the universe answered his fatigue with a nightmare. On July 23rd, James Jordan pulled his red Lexus over on a North Carolina highway for a nap. He was murdered by two teenagers in a random act of senseless, opportunistic violence. His body was dumped in a swamp, unidentified for weeks, while the world wondered where the father of the king had gone. When the news finally broke, the foundation of Michael's world didn't just crack, it vanished. James had been his buffer, his only tether to the boy who had cried in a locked room in 1978. Without the man leaning against the truck, the championships were just circles of gold that could buy nothing back. The funeral was a blur of black ink and parched earth. Behind his dark glasses, Michael's eyes were dry, not from a lack of grief, but from a total systemic dehydration of the soul. He realized that the singular drive that had fueled his ascent, the need for his father's nod, was now a road leading to nowhere. 3 months later, at the absolute zenith of his physical powers and the height of his global fame, Michael Jordan walked into a press conference and told the world he was done. It wasn't a negotiation. It was an abdication. He walked away from the throne to chase a ghost into the dirt of the minor leagues. The baseball years were a masterpiece of self-mutilation. In the sweltering heat of Birmingham, Alabama, the greatest athlete on the planet, rode a bus for 10 hours a day, ate cold pizza, and struggled to hit a curveball in front of crowds that had come to see a freak show. The media laughed, calling him a disgrace and a delusional failure. But in the grit of the batter's box, Michael found a strange, masochistic peace. He was washing off the divinity that had begun to feel like a shroud. He spent his nights in a motel room, talking to the silence, imagining his father was somewhere in the stands, watching him fail at something new. He had to fall all the way back to earth, back to the dirt, to find the hunger again. He wasn't just playing baseball. He was conducting a private seance. He was waiting for a signal, a reason to burn again that wasn't about the endorsements or the public's appetite for a hero. He was a man in the middle of a spiritual strike, proving to himself that even if he lost the world, he still owned the right to walk away from it. On March 18, 1995, 2 words vibrated across the wire of a cold Atlantic fax machine, carrying an arrogance that felt like a thunderclap. "I'm back." The world held its breath, expecting the god of 1993 to descend from the clouds in full armor. Instead, they got a man in a strange number 45 jersey, gasping for air in the thin oxygen of game speed. His footwork was heavy, his legendary fadeaway clanked off the back iron, and the supernatural timing that had once allowed him to manipulate the very flow of time was gone, rusted by 18 months of chasing curveballs in the Alabama dirt. The low point came in the playoffs against the Orlando Magic. Nick Anderson, a young pup with nothing to lose, stripped the ball from Jordan's hands from behind, a theft of dignity that would have been unthinkable 2 years prior. The Magic won the series, and the narrative shifted with a cruel, surgical efficiency. The king was old, the king was mortal, and the game had moved on without him. That failure was the greatest gift the universe could have given him. It provided Michael Jordan with a target. That summer, a surreal spectacle unfolded on the Warner Bros. Studio lot in Los Angeles. To accommodate the filming of Space Jam, the studio erected a massive, air-conditioned tent that the media dubbed the Jordan Dome. Inside, between takes of acting alongside cartoons, Jordan transformed the space into a private, high-stakes slaughterhouse. He invited the league's elite, Reggie Miller, Patrick Ewing, Penny Hardaway, under the guise of pickup games. In reality, he was using them as lab rats. He forced these all-stars into playoff intensity sessions in the sweltering California heat, systematically reclaiming his muscle memory at their expense. He wasn't just getting back in shape. He was conducting a psychological census of his enemies, reminding them, one jumper at a time, that the hiatus was over. He was rebuilding the Air Jordan brand, not with marketing, but with the sweat of men who had dared to think he was finished. When the 1995-96 season began, the league encountered a version of Jordan that was no longer interested in the aesthetics of flight. He had outsourced the heavy lifting of perimeter defense to Scottie Pippen, his perfect shadow, whose long-limbed brilliance allowed Michael to conserve his vitriol for the kill. Jordan had become a master of the mid-range post-up, a heavy, grounded, and utterly unguardable sequence of bumps and turnaround. He used his body as a blunt instrument, feeling the rhythm of a defender's heartbeat against his back before extinguishing their hope with a flick of his wrist. 72 wins and 10 losses. It wasn't a record. It was a scorched earth policy. He moved through the league like a scythe through wheat, his eyes fixed on a singular haunting destination. The NBA Finals on June 16, 1996. At the United Center in Chicago, the clock bled out on the Seattle Supersonics. The Bulls were champions again. But as the confetti rained down and the stadium shook with a roar that bordered on worship, Michael Jordan did something that broke the heart of the world. He grabbed the game ball and sprinted away from the cameras, collapsing onto the greasy industrial floor of the locker room. He curled into a fetal position, sobbing with a violence that shook his entire frame. It was Father's Day. This was the true price of the resurrection. For a year, he had driven himself with a pathological fury, telling himself that winning again would somehow bridge the gap between his hands and the ghost of James Jordan. In that locker room, the silence of his father's absence was louder than the cheering of 20,000 fans. He had reclaimed his throne, but he realized that the throne was just a cold piece of metal if there was no one left to tell him he had done a good job. He had traded every ounce of his human warmth to become a basketball machine once more, and the victory brought no peace, only a profound, hollow exhaustion. He had proven he was still the best on earth, but in doing so, he had finalized his divorce from the boy who just wanted his dad to watch him play. He stood up, wiped the salt and grime from his face, and walked back out into the light. He was no longer Mike. He was a monument. And monuments do not feel. They only endure. Inside a darkened hotel room, Michael Jordan lay curled in a fetal position, his body racked by the violent tremors of food, poisoning, or a viral infection that felt like a slow-motion execution. His skin was a sickly, translucent gray. His eyes were sunken pits of fever. The medical staff spoke in hushed, funereal tones, suggesting that the god of Chicago was, for the first time, grounded by the treachery of his own biology. Across the city, the Utah Jazz smelled blood. They were a disciplined, lunch-pail army led by Stockton and Malone, and they believed that the era of the Bulls was finally rotting from within. Jerry Krause, the Bulls' rotund and resentful general manager, had already publicly sharpened the guillotine, declaring that this team, no matter the outcome, would be dismantled at season's end. The betrayal of the front office, and the betrayal of his own stomach lining, had conspired to bring Jordan to his knees. But what followed was the flu game, a haunting piece of athletic martyrdom. When Jordan emerged from the tunnel, he looked like a ghost haunting his own jersey. He moved with a heavy, agonizing lethargy, his mouth parched and his chest heaving for oxygen that wasn't there. During Timmy-outs, he slumped on the bench, head buried in a towel, his soul seemingly leaking out through his pores. Yet, every time the whistle blew, a terrifying, necrotic willpower took over. He scored 38 points, including a dagger three-pointer that silenced the Delta Center. As the final buzzer sounded, the legend was etched in a single, cinematic frame. Jordan, completely spent and slipping toward the floor, being held upright by Scottie Pippen. It was a pietà of the hardwoods, the king dying in the arms of his most loyal knight, refusing to surrender until the territory was secured. The 1997-98 season was the last dance, a year-long wake conducted in the bright lights of the global stage. The tension between the players and crowds was a toxic fog that followed them from city to city. Pippen was underpaid and angry. Phil Jackson was a lame duck coach. Rodman was drifting into the neon distractions of professional wrestling. Jordan stood in the center of this hurricane, a grim conductor forcing a crumbling orchestra to play one last masterpiece. He wasn't just fighting the Jazz or the Pacers. He was fighting the very concept of the end. June 14th, 1998. Game 6 in Utah. The Delta Center was a cacophony of white noise and desperate hope. With less than a minute left, the Bulls trailed by a point. The dynasty was gasping for air. Karl Malone, the mailman, held the ball in the post, looking to deliver the knockout blow. Jordan, reading the air like a predator sensing a shift in the wind, ghosted behind Malone and stripped the ball with a sudden, violent precision. There was no timeout called. There was no plan B. There was only the singular, terrifying inevitability of the man in the red jersey. He brought the ball up the court with a slow, deliberate cadence, as if he were savoring the final seconds of his reign. He drove toward the top of the key, faced by Brian Russell, with a subtle, surgical push-off, a whisper of veteran craft. Jordan sent Russell stumbling into the abyss of history. For a heartbeat, the entire world stopped breathing. Jordan rose into the air, his form a perfect, geometric silhouette against the hostile backdrop. The flick of the wrist was a mechanical grace. The ball arched through the Utah sky and tore through the net with a sound like a silk sheet ripping. That was the last shot. Jordan held his follow-through for an extra second, his hand suspended in the air like a priest finishing a benediction. He wasn't just watching the ball go in. He was acknowledging the closure of an epoch. He had killed the Jazz. He had killed Krause's timeline. And he had killed the doubt. He finished the game with 45 points, dragging a limping, exhausted team across the finish line of a second three-peat. As he stood on the scorer's table, holding up 6 fingers, he looked less like an athlete and more like a conqueror who had burnt the maps so he could never return home. He had won everything there was to win, and in doing so, he had ensured that his departure would be a void that no successor could ever truly fill. He walked off the court into the shadows of the tunnel, a cigar already waiting, leaving behind a league that he had broken and rebuilt in his own image. Washington, D.C., in the winter of 2001, was a city of gray marble and bone-chilling dampness. When Michael Jordan stepped into the locker room of the MCI Center, the reflection in the mirror was a stranger. At 38, the skin around his eyes had tightened into a permanent map of skepticism, and his knees carried a dull, throbbing ache that whispered of fluid and friction with every step. This second comeback was not the triumphant return of a king. It was a desperate, scorched earth attempt to salvage a franchise's balance sheet and a man's own pathological need for friction. He was attempting to restart a cold engine in a world that had already moved on to sleeker, younger models. The reality of the Wizards was a brutal, unadorned insult to his legacy. Jordan found himself surrounded by a generation of players who had grown up worshiping his posters, but possessed none of the monastic discipline that had put him there. Kwame Brown, the teenage #1 draft pick, became the focal point of Jordan's mounting bile. Michael did not know how to mentor. He only knew how to hunt. He treated the locker room like a courtroom and the practice court like an interrogation room, using his tongue to strip the confidence from the young players until they were hollow shells. He wanted to see a reflection of his own feral hunger in their eyes, But all he found was a mix of bewilderment and a quiet, simmering resentment. He was a relic shouting at a future that didn't speak his language. Yet, there were nights when the ghost of Chicago would possess the body of the old man. On December 29, 2001, against the Charlotte Hornets, Jordan dragged his swollen joints onto the hardwood and unleashed a 51-point masterpiece. It was a haunting, heavy-handed display, a man using every ounce of craft, every subtle elbow, and every textbook fade away to defy the gravity of his own age. But these outbursts were no longer the heralds of a championship. They were the flickering of a candle in a hurricane. For every 50-point night, there were 3 nights spent on a training table with ice bags strapped to his legs like heavy shackles. He was no longer the god who could carry a city. He was a gladiator refusing to acknowledge the arena was empty. The ultimate sentence was delivered by the passage of time itself. In 2003, during his final trip to Philadelphia, he looked across the court at Kobe Bryant. In the younger man's movements, the obsessive footwork, the jutting jaw, the refusal to blink, Jordan saw a mirror of his own younger, more lethal self. Kobe was attacking him with the same predatory disrespect Jordan had once shown to Larry Bird. It was a visceral, physical passing of the flame, a recognition that the Black Mamba was the new apex predator in a jungle that no longer had room for an aging lion. Jordan felt the explosive power of the youth and realized that while his mind could still map out the kill, his muscles were no longer capable of executing the strike. The final buzzer in Philadelphia on April 16, 2003, brought a 3-minute standing ovation, but for Jordan, it was the sound of a closing casket. He sat on the bench, his face twitching slightly as he fought back the indignity of ordinary failure. He hadn't made the playoffs. He hadn't transformed the Wizards into a dynasty. He had merely proven that he was human. A realization that tasted like ash. As he began the ritual of unpeeling the thick, sweat-soaked tape from his ankles, the tape that held his crumbling joints together for one last hour, he didn't look for his teammates' approval. He ignored the champagne and the camera. He stood up, grabbed his sneakers, and walked down the long, narrow tunnel toward the exit. The fluorescent lights overhead were harsh and unforgiving, stretching his shadow across the concrete until he looked like a giant, then a man, then nothing at all. The boy from Wilmington was finally, irrevocably, out of time. He swapped the sweat-soaked jersey for the razor-sharp silhouette of a bespoke suit, taking his seat in the owner's box of the Charlotte Hornets. He became a titan of industry, a man whose Jumpman silhouette was no longer a sports logo, but a global currency, a monolith of cool that transcended the game itself. Yet, if you watched him in the dim light of a luxury suite, you could see that the boardroom provided no substitute for the blood on the hardwood. He remained a predator without a jungle, a man whose competitiveness had become a beautiful, terrifying deformity. He would gamble on a game of cards or a round of golf with the same soul-crushing intensity he once used to dismantle the Detroit Pistons, searching for a ghost of the friction that had once defined his existence. In 2020, as the world ground to a halt, the documentary The Last Dance stripped away the layers of corporate polish. It revealed not a cuddly elder statesman, but a man who still clutched 30-year-old grudges like jagged glass. Sitting in a leather chair with a glass of tequila, his eyes bloodshot with the weight of 1,000 sleepless victories, he mocked his old enemies and demanded perfection from a past that was already written. The public finally saw the truth. His greatness was never built on joy. It was built on a scorched earth policy of the spirit. He was lonely, but it was a loneliness he had meticulously engineered. A trench he had dug to keep the mediocre at bay. He had won the war, but he had forgotten how to live in the peace. The most profound crack in the armor appeared in February 2020 on the floor of the Staples Center. Standing before a sea of mourning fans at Kobe Bryant's memorial, Michael Jordan did the one thing the world thought he was incapable of. He let the mask slip. Tears streamed down his face, unchecked and ugly in their honesty. In Kobe, the man who had chased his shadow with a religious fervor, Jordan had found his only true mirror. Watching that fire go out was like watching a part of his own immortality perish. For a few minutes, he wasn't the billionaire owner or the greatest of all time. He was just a man grieving a younger brother, who had understood the terrible, beautiful cost of being a god. It was a rare moment of human resonance, a signal that beneath the rings and the billions, the boy from Wilmington was still there, shivering in the cold. Today, Michael Jordan often sits on his yacht, Catch-22, drifting in the blue expanse of the Atlantic. The name is a silent admission. He spent his life fighting to be free of the world's expectations, only to realize he is now a prisoner of his own legend. The silence of the ocean is the only thing that matches the silence of the arena after the lights go out. He has reached the ultimate destination of the obsessive, a place where there are no more enemies to conquer and no more father figures to impress. He remains the gold standard, the haunting blueprint for every child who picks up a ball. But he exists in a state of magnificent isolation. He is a monument weathered by the winds of his own ambition, a figure of bronze and ice, standing at the end of time, watching the tide come in, and wondering if, in the final accounting, the win was worth the hollow. The snow has fallen on the white garden, and the king is left alone with his crown.